London, 1887. You're walking down a street that doesn't exist anymore. On one side, a terrace of two-room cottages built for factory workers, each one barely wider than a modern hallway. On the other, a row of ornate villas with stucco frontages and iron railings, built for a merchant class that wanted the world to know it. The Victorians built for every class, every budget, and every ambition. And they built in styles that are almost entirely gone. 10 of them are in this video. Some you'll recognise from old photographs. Others you've walked past the ghost of without knowing what you were looking at. The court dwelling was not a house at all in any recognisable sense. It was a room, or two rooms, built around a shared internal courtyard that could only be accessed through a covered entry passage from the street. You walked through the archway, and the court opened up, a yard perhaps 20 feet across, surrounded on all sides by three-storey blocks of single-room tenements. The whole court shared one or two standpipes for water and a row of privies in the corner. Liverpool and Manchester had thousands of them by 1850. One court in Liverpool, in 1840, was recorded as housing 63 people in 12 rooms, around a yard with one water tap and two privies. They were officially condemned as insanitary in the 1875 Public Health Act, but demolition moved slowly. Many survived into the 1890s, a few into the 1900s. They left almost no physical trace. What they left was a phrase. When Victorians wanted to describe genuine poverty, they said someone lived in a court. Everyone knew what that meant. The back-to-back was the defining working-class house of the Victorian industrial city. Two rows of terraced houses, built sharing a single rear wall, no backyard, no through ventilation, a front door that opened directly onto the street, and nothing behind you but someone else's bedroom wall. Birmingham, Leeds and Bradford had tens of thousands of them by 1880. They were built fast and cheap by mill and factory owners to house incoming labour. A family of 6 lived in 2 rooms on 2 floors, each room roughly 12 feet square. There was no running water inside. The privy was shared between several households in a courtyard at the end of the row. The air inside barely moved. Tuberculosis spread easily. By 1918, public health reports were calling them unfit for habitation. Birmingham began demolishing its back-to-backs in the 1930s. The last inhabited ones were cleared in the 1960s. A surviving court in Ing Street, Birmingham, is now a National Trust museum. It is the only complete back-to-back court left in the country. In the Black Country and the South Wales valleys, the Victorian iron and steel industry produced a specific house type for a specific class. The ironmaster's villa, a large detached house set on the hillside above the works, positioned so the owner could see his furnaces and his workforce at all times. Solid, square, stone-built, with good sash windows and a formal garden. Not quite a country house, not quite a suburban villa. Something in between, built for men who had risen very fast and wanted the view to prove it. The ironmasters who built them were often gone within 2 generations. The works closed, the families moved on, and the villas were left on hillsides above industrial landscapes that gradually became post-industrial wastelands. Many were demolished when the ground underneath them became unstable from decades of mining subsidence. Some were converted to clubs or nursing homes. A handful survive as private residences. The furnaces they were built to overlook long cold. The valleys below them either emptied or redeveloped into something unrecognisable. On the great landed estates of Victorian England, the entrance drive was often lined with a particular kind of cottage, built entirely for appearance. The cottage ornée, ornamental cottage, was designed by the estate architect to look picturesque from the carriage window. Thatched roof, leaded lights, ornamental chimney stacks, a small formal garden visible from the gate. Inside, the estate gamekeeper, or head gardener, lived in relatively good conditions by working-class standards. Outside, the cottage performed the idea of rural England for the landowner and their guests. As the great estates broke up through inheritance tax and agricultural decline after the First World War, the cottage ornés were often sold off separately. Some became weekend retreats for urban professionals. Some were let and slowly fell into disrepair. The style itself was never revived commercially because it was always more theatre than architecture. What was being built wasn't a cottage, it was a backdrop. The genuine article required an estate behind it, and most of those estates were gone by 1950. Similar to the back-to-back, but with a narrow strip of yard behind, just enough space to avoid the worst of the ventilation problem, not enough to be called a garden. The rear wall had no windows on the ground floor, only a small opening above. That's where the name came from. Blind at the back, these were built by the 100,000 in Yorkshire and Lancashire mill towns through the 1850s and 1870s. They were a step up from the back-to-back. You had a yard, you had a privy of your own or shared with just one neighbour, but they were still damp, still dark, and still built to pack as many households as possible onto the cheapest land available. Most were slated for clearance under post-war housing acts. The council estates that replaced them had gardens, they had inside bathrooms, they had central heating eventually. What they didn't have was the density of community that the blind back streets had built, street by street, over 80 years. The 1860s and 1870s produced a serious attempt to house the urban poor in something better than courts and back-to-backs. Philanthropic organisations, the Peabody Trust from 1862, the Improved Industrial Dwellings Company from 1863, began constructing model dwelling blocks. 5 or 6 stories of brick, internal staircases open to the air, each flat with its own scullery and water supply. Built around a courtyard, designed to be decent. They were functional and hygienic by the standards of what they replaced. They were also stark, institutional, and built to house as many people as possible in as small a footprint as the land allowed. The Victorians called them model dwellings. The people who lived in them called them barracks. Most were demolished by the 1960s and 1970s, replaced by the council tower blocks that had their own catastrophic history. The Peabody Trust still exists and still manages housing in London. The original model dwelling blocks that haven't been demolished have mostly been converted into private flats. In Islington, a surviving Peabody block from 1865 sold individual units for upwards of £400,000 in 2022. Not Gothic Revival in the grand sense, no pointed windows, no carved barge boards. But through the 1860s and 1870s, a vernacular version filtered down into working-class terrace housing. Builders added small decorative touches borrowed from Gothic pattern books, a slightly pointed arch over the front door, a band of moulded brick at first floor level, a terracotta panel above the window with a simple leaf or diamond motif pressed into it. The house was still a 2 up, 2 down. The street was still cobbled, but someone had decided that the door surround deserved a little thought. These details were cheap to add when the moulds and bricks were already on site. They cost almost nothing, and they gave the street a dignity that plain brick would not have. Most of these terraces were cleared in the comprehensive redevelopment programs of the 1950s and 1960s. The housing surveys that condemned them measured room sizes and damp levels. They did not measure the pressed terracotta panels above the windows, and nobody thought to save them before the demolition crews arrived. Across the chalk downlands of Norfolk, Suffolk and Sussex, the Victorian vernacular cottage was built from a material that had been under people's feet for centuries. Flint, rounded cobbles split to show the dark glassy interior, set in courses of lime mortar, sometimes combined with brick quoins at the corners. The effect was a wall that glittered faintly, in low light, dense and irregular, and deeply local. Flint cottages were the homes of agricultural labourers, 1 up, 1 down, a shared well in the yard, a vegetable plot at the rear. They were built by local craftsmen using whatever the land offered, because transporting brick to remote downland villages was expensive. As brick became cheaper and railways opened up rural areas through the 1870s and 1880s, flint construction declined rapidly. New cottages were built in brick. Existing ones were often rendered over to look more modern. Finding a genuinely unaltered Victorian flint cottage today requires looking in the smaller villages, the ones that didn't expand after the railway arrived. They're still there, but not many of them. The 1840s and 1850s produced a particular kind of middle-class fantasy house, driven by the architectural fashion sparked by Pugin and the new Palace of Westminster. The Gothic Revival villa, steeply pitched roofs, pointed arched windows, decorative barge boards carved into lacework at the eaves, tall chimneys with moulded pots, built in brick or stone, usually standing alone in a modest plot, and designed to look, at a slight squint, like a miniature medieval manor house. They were built for solicitors, factory managers, and prosperous tradesmen who wanted a home that looked old money without costing it. By the 1870s, the fashion had passed. The Italianate villa replaced it. Then the red brick Queen Anne style, and the Gothic Revival house became associated with the slightly trying taste of an earlier generation. Most were absorbed into suburbs as towns expanded. Some were converted to offices or nursing homes. New ones stopped being built entirely by about 1890. A few survive on the edges of Victorian town centres, looking slightly startled, with their pointed windows and fretwork gables surrounded by things built 100 years after them. Across the prosperous suburbs of Victorian cities, Edgbaston in Birmingham, Headingley in Leeds, Clifton in Bristol, the semi-detached villa was the aspirational middle-class house before the Edwardian semi took over. Built in pairs, each half designed to look as much as possible like a detached house. A wide frontage, a bay window reaching to the first floor, a short front garden with iron railings, the joint line between the two halves treated architecturally, so that from across the road you could almost convince yourself it was one large house. The style peaked between roughly 1850 and 1885 and was then overtaken by the influence of Norman Shaw and the red brick Queen Anne revival. The urban villa pair is still standing all over inner suburban Britain. What has vanished is the class that built it and the way of life it contained. The cook in the basement kitchen, the parlour kept for visitors, the morning room where the mistress of the house spent her day. The houses survived. Everything they were designed to contain did not.